Members of the US Congress flocked to Syria as Washington explores how to improve ties with Damascus. But under what conditions would the present situation improve? And how important is Syria to the US in the Middle East? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Sahil Rahman. Is the new United States administration reaching out to what George Bush called the axis of evil? Several high-ranking members of the US Congress have been in Syria on a series of visits that could be seen as a warming of diplomatic relations between the two nations. Washington removed its ambassador from Damascus in 2005 after the assassination of the former Lebanese Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri, although Syria denies being involved in that attack. Senator John Kerry heads the US Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He's just the latest in a series of high-profile visitors to the region. In the last 2 years, former President Jimmy Carter and the Democratic House Speaker Nancy Pelosi have travelled to the country. Both were criticised by the Bush administration, claiming they could hurt US interests with their visits. Kerry, a former presidential candidate, has suggested Barack Obama may be more open to dealing with Syria than his predecessor.
This is a region that has been struggling for peace and stability for a long time. It's no secret that some of us had big differences with the last administration of our country over our policies in the region. Now we have an opportunity with a new president, President Obama, a new administration, and with a Democratic Congress to put in place a different approach.
Well, the senator may be optimistic about the future, but the United States is still asking Syria to abide by a number of conditions before full diplomatic relations can be restored. America wants Syria to lessen its support for military groups such as Hezbollah and Palestinian factions that are non-Fatah, like Hamas. The US also feels Syria's relationship with Iran is too close. They're asking Damascus to distance itself from its long-standing ally. Syria opposed the 2003 invasion of Iraq, and the United States has accused it of allowing fighters to move across its border. The US is now asking Syria to get more involved in stabilising the situation in Iraq. And finally, with elections in Lebanon coming up, Syria is being asked to respect the country's sovereignty and not be seen to interfere in its internal politics. Well, joining us now are our guests in Damascus, Marwan Karbalan, a political analyst and a professor at Damascus University. In New York, Seth Kaplan, a US foreign policy analyst who has authored the book Fixing Fragile States. And finally, in Beirut, Rami Khouri, who is the director of the Issam Faris Institute at the American University of Beirut. Gentlemen, thank you. Marwan Karbalan, can I come to you first? What does it really mean to have such high-profile politicians, not just in the region, but in Syria especially?
Well, I think this is a positive development I mean, this is how it's seen here in Damascus. U.S. delegations, high-profile U.S. delegations visiting Syria. This is something that was not really possible under the Bush administration, or at least was opposed by the Bush administration when some congressmen were trying really, I mean, to come and to have a sort of dialogue with Syria in order to solve range of problems between the two countries. But keep in mind, actually, that here also, despite, I mean, this optimistic climate here in Damascus, people are still cautious because, as Senator Kerry has just mentioned, people here think that the change might be only in approach rather than something that is substantial. The United States is still asking Syria actually to do certain things or repeating things actually that the Bush administration was always had always asked Syria to do.
We'll come to those issues in a moment. I just want to bring in Rami Khouri here. I just want your take on it from the other side of the border in Beirut, in Lebanon. You have a different take to how the Americans are perhaps seen in Syria.
Well, the majority of Lebanese, of whom I'm not one, I'm Palestinian Jordanian, but the majority of Lebanese are divided about U.S. relations with Syria. Many would like closer ties between the U.S. and Syria, and others are worried about what Syria wants to do in Lebanon and would like the U.S. to keep up the pressure. But I think the reality is that what is going on in the U.S.-Syrian bilateral relationship with these visits is just one of many signals, and these are only signals that we're getting out of the young Obama administration that probably indicate at least a desire by the U.S. to reposition itself so that it is a more credible mediator, potentially, between the Arabs and the Israelis. We've got several indications of that with Mitchell appointment and visits to Gaza, visits to Syria, Clinton going to the conference in Cairo to raise money for Gaza. There's signals like this that are very important, but they don't amount to a significant radical change yet, but they certainly are refreshing from what we had under Condoleezza Rice and George Bush.
Well, before we get into the specifics, let me just come up to Seth Kaplan. And just broadly speaking, I mean, we've been talking about seeing Jimmy Carter, Nancy Pelosi and now John Kerry in the region. Do you think the tone is really changing in Washington, or is this just a photo opportunity with very little substance behind it?
I think it's kind of early to draw a conclusion, but very obviously the new administration and the Democrats in general prefer more dialogue, prefer more engagement. The real question is whether this is very superficial and just rhetoric, or whether they're actually going to change policy. And I need to point out that U.S. interests in the region have not changed dramatically in the last 2 months from Bush to Obama, but certainly the style has changed quite dramatically.
Rami Khouri mentioned just a moment ago the mention of George Mitchell, the new Middle East envoy. Do you think all of these visits, Seth, are a prelude to a George Mitchell visit to Syria and to Lebanon as well?
I think it's very possible that he will visit both capitals. I think it's very possible that the new administration is going to increase the engagement with Damascus. But I think some of the demands that the last administration had pushed forward over Iran, over Iraq, over Lebanon, over Hamas and Hezbollah are not going to change. And I think the real question is going to be, even with these visits and even with an attempt at greater engagement, how close will there be a change to something that will be significantly different from before? It's not obvious that something is going to change dramatically, even if an ambassador is sent back to Damascus, and even if there's much more dialogue between the two governments.
Well, let's go to specifics now and look at how countries around Syria are affected. Let's start with Iran. And Rami Khouri, I mean, how does the Syria-Iran puzzle fit in terms of the United States?
Well, I think the Syria-Iran relationship is not so much a puzzle as it is a kind of a lid over this whole region. That's really probably the most critical relationship within the region that has to be addressed and acknowledged. In the long run, the Syrian-Iranian relationship is slightly unnatural. It's not a relationship that's going to go on forever in its present configuration. In the short run, it served both of them very well. The Iranians and the Syrians are linked to every single important point of tension and actor in this region, between the Israelis, the Palestinians, Fatah, Hamas, Lebanon, Iraq. Every single issue is tied directly or indirectly to Syria and Iran. Therefore, those two countries need to be active players in a diplomatic process that looks at Israeli and Arab and Iranian interests as being equal. And this is really the critical point we need to hear from Obama. Seth mentioned that there's a change in tone possibly, but American interests haven't changed. We don't think in this region, by and large, that we know if America is actually working for American interests or if it is largely reacting to what are seen to be Israeli priorities or trying to find a mixture of the two. And this is really something the Americans have to come clean on very soon, because you can have Israeli, American, Arab, Iranian interests all satisfied, legitimate interests satisfied simultaneously.
Seth, I want to ask you if you agree to that, because what Rami was just saying there was about the Obama administration giving a fair hand to the region, but yet one would assume that the Americans would like to pull Syria away from that Iranian connection and perhaps weaken the ties, though I think they're realistic and know they wouldn't be able to break them permanently.
I think that's a very correct assessment. I'm sure the new administration would like very much to isolate Iran. At the same time, it's trying to negotiate with Iran on some level. And one of the major ways to do that would be to dislodge Syria from its connection to Tehran. But having said that, if I was sitting in Damascus and I was comparing who was a more reliable partner, Iran or the United States, I'm pretty sure that they will not easily distance themselves from a relationship that's been pretty steady for a very long period of time. But certainly people in Washington do believe that they can do something to weaken that relationship and will attempt to do so.
Well, Marwan Karbalan, even though the ties between Syria and Iran might be weakened by an American connection as such, the ties between Syria and some Palestinian groups such as Hamas and Hezbollah as such in southern Lebanon are still very strong. They're going to be more difficult to tackle, aren't they?
Well, I think, let me start by talking about this Syrian-Iranian relationship. I think Syria believes that it can have both good relations with Iran and with the United States, because this actually was the case during most of the 90s when Syria was involved in the peace process and enjoying warm relations with the United States and having good relations with Iran as well. So the thinking here in Damascus actually is not trading the relationship with Iran with the United States. As far as Hamas and Hezbollah are concerned, Syria believes that these two movements are resistance movements, and I mean the occupation for Syria is the cause which has led to the creation of this resistance. And if the occupation ceased to exist, then there would be no point from carrying out or continuing with this resistance. Syria, I don't think, is going to weaken its relationship with Hamas or with either Hamas or Hezbollah unless, I believe, Syria and all the parties concerned in the region conclude a peace treaty with Israel. Then there would be no need actually for Hamas or Hezbollah to continue their resistance to Israel. But what Syria can really contribute in this case, in my opinion, is to help persuading Hamas actually to get involved in a Palestinian unity government and in a national reconciliation process, which would make it more easy, I mean, to have peace talks between the Palestinians and the Israelis.
Right, well, we'll hold that thought for a moment. We'll take a short break and we'll come back to that issue on the Palestinians, because when we do come back, what are the hurdles facing a thaw in US-Syria relations? Stay with us here on Inside Story.